Welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, the key to PMP exam success. Here's your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner.
Hello and welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, where we help you understand the PMBOK guide rather than memorizing it. I'm your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner. In this lesson, we discuss the how-to of conducting your procurements, which is part of Project Procurement Management. In this lesson, we specifically discuss how procurement complexity impacts the process required, the different forms of bidder conferences, weighting systems that are used in the analysis of sellers, screening and seller systems for evaluation, negotiation and more negotiation and more negotiation and more negotiation, and also estimates and seller proposals. Conducting procurements isn't as simple as just dropping into your local hardware store and getting the items that you need to do a home project. It involves executing a plan, seller or vendor selection, negotiations, contracts and agreements, and a bunch more, as you will learn. We cut this lesson up into two parts. In part one, we'll look at the overview, the inputs, and the first few tools and techniques. In part two, we'll continue with the final tools and techniques, the outputs review, and of course a sample question as well. The Project Procurement Management knowledge area includes the processes that are necessary to purchase or acquire products, services, or results needed from outside the project team. And the processes that help us do that are, first of all, plan procurement management. This is the process of documenting project procurement decisions, specifying the approach, and identifying potential sellers. From here, we move on to conducting our procurements. This is the process of obtaining seller responses, selecting a seller, and awarding a contract. Then we continue with control procurements. This is the process of managing procurement relationships, monitoring contract performance, and making changes and corrections as appropriate. And finally, we also have to close our procurements. This is simply the process of completing each project procurement. And these four processes neatly fall into four separate process groups. Plan procurements management, planning, controlling procurements, monitoring and controlling. Closing procurements is, of course, in the closing process group. Right now, we are focusing on the conduct procurements process, and this one is part of the executing process group. The main concept behind this process of obtaining seller responses, selecting a seller, and awarding a contract is best illustrated in this process map here. So according to the procurement management plan that we created in the previous lesson, procurement documents which provide details for bidding are sent to all our sellers, and a response is then received from these sellers as well. The typical response is a seller proposal. These proposals are compared against predefined selection criteria. A seller is then selected to whom we award the contract. It's not really all that difficult to understand overall. However, there are a number of important details that we are going to review in this lesson. And one of those details has to do with the size of your procurement needs and how that affects the complexity of the process that you follow. Consider the case of a medical device company needing to purchase or acquire a product lifecycle management system. This system will allow them to track all component information at each stage of the production. If the company doesn't have very complex and elaborate product needs, a common COTS, that is commercial off-the-shelf product, may satisfy the company's requirements. Therefore, the process is usually an analysis where the requirements are compared to the features that are provided by the available commercial software solution for that industry. Select a vendor and negotiate a contract that includes implementation. But let's say that the best COTS solution only provides 70% of the required functionality. Then the process gets more complex. First, a business analyst will have to conduct a gap analysis between the best solution, all factors considered, and the must-have requirements. Then these gaps need to be filled with other commercial software, or more likely building custom functionality and interfaces. This requires design, specifications, RFP requests for proposals based on design and specs and vendor selection and contract negotiating with multiple vendors, maybe service level agreements, etc. You can see this is much more complicated and usually much more expensive. But suppose that the product needs are highly complex and the regulatory requirements are such that greater functionality and reporting is required than any COTS or consulting solution out there, has it. The decision is therefore made to resort to internal talent, which means the IT software developers and system analysts building this thing. So the recommendation then is to buy a very versatile product and platform that will allow plug-and-play capability for some needs, but build custom modules for other in-house requirements and farm some work to external consulting groups. This is the most complex option and sometimes the best longer-term solution, but very complex in regards to procurement and may involve multiple vendors, multiple contracts, multiple agreements and management. It's a big investment up front. And with all of that out of the way, let's begin our review of the ITTOs, the inputs, tools, techniques and outputs for the conduct procurements process. And one thing that's immediately obvious here on our overview figure from the PMBOK guide, the large number of inputs, tools, techniques and outputs. We have 8 inputs, 7 tools and techniques and 6 outputs. A lot goes into procurement for a project, especially those that are very elaborate. It will be quite a job for us to explain it all to you as well. So let's get started. We have so many inputs that we decided not to use our usual format here on this slide, but instead just show them to you as a list. So inputs are the project management plan, procurement documents, the source selection criteria, we have seller proposals, project documents, we have make or buy decisions, we have procurement statements of work, as well as organizational process assets. As always, the list here is nice to see, but it's really much more interesting to understand why we need them as inputs and what do they provide. So let's jump into these and look at why we need them. And whenever we discuss how inputs, tools and techniques and outputs are used in a process, we need to consider the context and objectives of the current process. Our goal here is to select a seller from a list of several potential suppliers and then award a contract. So as we review our inputs and discuss them, keep this goal in mind. So here's a list of inputs and how they contribute towards our goal of selecting a seller. First of all, the make or buy decisions. The outcome of make or buy decisions will determine if a seller is needed for a project need or not. Without these, we wouldn't know which of our products or services require a seller. Is there a procurement need, or are we building this in-house? Second, we have the project documents. Here we must mostly consider the risk register and ensure that we understand the risks associated with the products that we may want to buy. This helps us use the appropriate contract and contract language to use for a particular procurement. Next, we have the organizational process assets. Here we consider prior lists of prospective and qualified sellers, or we could have an internal policy that discusses specific requirements in regards to the process of selecting a seller. Then source selection criteria. These criteria, which we defined in the planned procurement process, these are used to evaluate each potential seller against our procurement needs. Examples include, but are not limited to, supplier capability, capacity, product and life cycle cost, as well as expertise. We also need to look at seller proposals. These are prepared in response to a procurement document package and provide the basic information required for our supplier and seller evaluation. Then the procurement management plan. It describes the process to be used to select the seller, from developing the procurement documentation up to all the way contract closure. For instance, you may have defined what is known as a negotiating sequence that defines that you must enter negotiations with the top 3 sellers once you have the weighting score of their proposal, and not just with the best one. The procurement documents are next here in our list. These provide an audit trail that link contracts and other agreements that we use during procurement. And our final input, the procurement statement of work. This provides prospective sellers with a clear set of goals and outcomes that they can use to draft and submit their proposals. Some examples here include specifications, the quantity that we need, and so on. In this way, everyone has an even playing field. The table we just saw gave us a pretty good idea why we need all our 8 inputs, but let's focus a little more on our procurement documents. We need these first of all because we need to provide them to our sellers. You cannot ask the seller for a response if you don't give them the documents that describe what and how they should bid on. The sellers use your procurement documents as a basis for their proposal. Second, you also need them for auditing activities. Once you receive the seller proposals back, you make sure that the seller has responded to all the questions that you have asked in your document package. Also, you may have required a certain format that the seller needs to follow so that you can more easily compare the various proposals, and therefore you will use your original package to compare the seller format to the required format. And by the way, your procurement documents, they are sometimes called request for proposal, RFP, invitation for bid, request for quotation, or invitation for negotiation. We are moving on to the tools and techniques of the conduct procurement process. We will discuss the first 4 right now. They are bidder conferences, proposal evaluation techniques, independent estimates, and expert judgment. We will discuss the other 3, advertising, analytical techniques, and procurement negotiations, in part 2. So what are bidder conferences? Well, bidder conferences are meetings with your potential sellers. In these meetings, you will give them all the necessary information about the project so that everyone has the same understanding. For instance, you will want to make sure that they understand your technical requirements, your contract requirements, and that you can answer any questions that they may have. Many of these questions may even need to be documented and then sent out as an addendum to the procurement documents. Vendor or bidder conferences, or whatever you may call them in your industry, use different approaches to achieve their objectives. Some send out the technical documents to the vendors prior to the meeting. Some send out only general outlines at first and then hand out the actual documents during the meeting. In some cases, you bring all the vendors together into one room, and in other cases, you meet with them individually. How you approach these conferences is more of a style question at what has worked for you in the past. Very important, however, is the fact that you must ensure that all sellers are given the same information and status during these conferences. Everyone gets the same information in order for them to produce the best bid for you. We saw a sample test question that discussed such a situation and assumed that you had a preferred seller on the list. The answers were then twisted in such a way that you could select to treat your preferred seller also preferentially, or treat them the same way as everyone else. The correct approach is, of course, to give them the same standing status or treatment, even if they are your preferred seller, not only from the point of view of the conduct procurement process, but also from the point of view of the PMI Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct, which we discuss in a separate lesson. However, you have to give equal status to everybody. A technique that is commonly used for evaluating proposals is the weighting system. This technique is supposed to help you analyze the proposals without prejudice. You know, we all like one seller over another, and we shouldn't really play favorites. Instead, we should choose the seller that is best for the project, not the one that you like best. These weighing systems usually work on some kind of rating scale where you assign numbers, and it's really a two-step process. First of all, you will look at each of your evaluation criteria and determine how important it is. For instance, you might say that the age of the seller's company is not all too important, so we give that a weight of 3 out of 10. However, the technical expertise is more important, so we give that a weight of 7 out of 10. And you do that for all of your criteria. We only list 5 here right now. And you do this usually before you send out the procurement documents. This is not usually something that you tell your sellers. In the second step, you will go through all of your seller proposals. You look at each of your criteria and assign a rating from 0 to 10. How well does this seller's response fulfill that requirement? 0 would mean not acceptable, and 10 is, of course, excellent. And by the way, here we have used a 0 to 10 scale. Of course, any scale is appropriate. It all depends on the project. This is just one of the many possible weighing systems. But in any case, in the end, we will have a score for each seller, 167 versus 173. That will allow us to make a selection. Some companies prefer to use screening and rating systems on their projects. Unlike the weighing system that looks at items that may be quantifiable, the screening system looks at the seller's performance. So, screening systems, as part of the screening system, you will define a minimum performance. For instance, the seller's project team must be on our site for the first 3 weeks of the project, or the assigned project manager must be a PMP, or products must be manufactured within the European Union, or whatever the minimum performance criteria might be. This will allow you to rank your seller in regards to performance. Then the seller rating system. If you happen to work in a large organization, it's likely that your company may have had dealings with many of the prospective sellers before. That means you have some in-house data about their past performance. For instance, how was the quality of the work that was delivered? Did they deliver according to your schedule? How well did they follow the terms of the contract, and so on? This information can now be used to rate the seller from the perspective of our own project. If you have such a seller rating system, you can definitely use this in addition to the weighting and screening systems as well. One question that I always ask myself when requesting seller proposals is, how much should this cost? I mean, it's always good to kind of have an idea of what the responses from your sellers should be. For instance, a few years back, I needed new gutters, rain gutters, for my house. And yes, this picture, by the way, is my home, and my home office is behind these windows here. Anyway, so for my new rain gutters, I asked 2 companies for their estimate. One came back with $638, and the other one, believe it or not, $1,260 for the same job. That was almost twice as much. So what I would have needed at this point was to have somebody come in and do an independent estimate. But I didn't know anybody in the business to do this for me, and I certainly didn't have the expertise to estimate this job myself. So I did the next best thing, and I simply asked a third company for their estimate, and they came in around $1,100. And this is pretty much the basic idea behind the tool and technique called independent estimate. You can either do that independent estimate yourself, or you can go to a third party to have it estimated. Therefore, when you get the proposals back, you can compare. And if you have big variances between the independent estimate and what your sellers propose, then you know that they did not 100% understand what you need. Usually, this is not the seller's fault, but it relates back to your own procurement documents. You obviously did not spell it out correctly. It can also be an indication that maybe the seller did not respond to everything in your request. Expert judgment is our next tool and technique, and experts could be used for evaluating potential vendors or suppliers. They can help you in evaluating seller proposals, or you could go as far as have separate teams with expertise in each area of your procurement process. Overall, expert judgment is simply another tool and technique that you may use to assist you with a number of required procurement tasks. Experts can come from many parts of your organization. You can have technical experts, legal experts, project management experts, subject matter experts, procurement experts, or manufacturing experts, and you bring these experts in for a review depending on the particular procurement. And their expert judgment is, of course, the invaluable tool and technique for this process. The broader based you can have this review done, the more fields and disciplines from within your company you can bring in and have them review the seller responses, the better your understanding of the quality of the seller response will be. Expert judgment should therefore not be underestimated as a tool and technique for conduct procurements. And this concludes part 1 of this lesson. Justine?
Take it easy.
Until next time.